Hello, Amen Rich. This is Becky here with Becky's Oregon Apple Pie. I'm going to go through the recipe with you because there are so many variables, east to west coast, in ingredients, and in the UK, I'm sure too. So let's start with some of the ingredients. To start, it calls for 3 American cups of flour, or 450 grams. I put it in grams because flour and measuring can be so different. Our flour is an all-purpose flour, which is okay for pies or bread. It's a medium flour. So the way we work the flour and the other ingredients together will change depending on the flour. You have to know what it's supposed to look like to know whether you've got it right. Some of the other ingredients that we'll be using for the pie crust is a little vodka, water, cold water, and vegetable shortening. Some people use lard or butter. This is 0 trans fats, and it makes a fairly light crust, and it's not lard, which is more vegetarian. Regular salt, and we'll be using salted butter in the apples. So that's the basic ingredients. We also need apples, which are going to be prepared in advance of the crust. So the first thing you need to do is to take 6 or more large apples and peel them and pare them down to thin slices. So these are probably 1/2 millimeter slices, and put them in acidulated water. You can use just bottled lemon juice is fine, and that way it keeps the apples from turning brown while you're doing your other things. So we'll set those aside until I go through the rest of these ingredients. In with the apples, we are going to use about 100 grams of white sugar and 50 grams of brown sugar, which is around 3/4 of a cup total sugar. Now that depends on how tart your apples are. You need good tart cooking apples. I'm using Granny Smith's. A tablespoon of flour, a teaspoon of cinnamon, and we'll be using some nutmeg later and a little butter, and that goes into the apple mixture that goes inside our pie. So we'll get to this part first. I want this to set and moisten up while we're making the pie crust. So this is just how we're going to do the crust, the pie shell. What I do first is I measure the amount of apples I need into the pie shell, the pie plate, and pack them down. And a little water is fine because I like a nice juicy pie. And we're going to pack it full and heap it up just a little bit. About like that. Okay? So that amount then goes into our bowl. And I'll dry that out before I put the pie shell in it. And then this is the mixture of the flour and the sugars. I'm going to sprinkle that in. And then I'm going to just stir the mixture together. And this will help bring out a little of the juice in the apples. And we'll do more with that in a bit. So, our apple plate. This is for a 9 to 10 inch pie, and my crust recipe makes more than one pie. So I always do a scrap pie on the side. Another thing that we need to do in advance is I have a pie ring. This is just a silicone pie ring that sets over the outside edge because the outside edge always cooks more quickly. If you don't have something like this, you can easily make one out of tin foil. Take pieces of tin foil and fold them together, and then I pleat them into a circle. And you'll need more than I'm doing. I'm just showing you basically. You just pleat this down into a circle until you have a circle that fits just the outer edge of your pie crust. So once I get that pre-made for this, then I put that on before it goes in the oven. When I roll out the pie dough, I have a couple of paint sticks that I picked up, or you can use a ruler or 2 rulers. They have to be equal depth because not everybody can roll an even pie crust. And what else do we need? I think that's all we need to do before we get started with the actual crust making next. All right, I already have the dry ingredients in here, the salt, the sugar, the flour, and shortening. I like to use one of these 2 tools. This is my favorite. If you don't have one of these, then something like this works. And the idea is you need to cut the shortening and the flour in together. So let's just get started with that. If you have rings that get stuff in them, might take those off because pie crust tends to get into your rings. Okay, so I'm cutting these together, and the way I'm going to know whether it is cut together or not is when all these chunks are very small, like very small, the size of small peas. And you won't see any of the white flour look left in them. And it takes a little time to get that to that stage. Okay, we're ready to move on to the next phase. See how crumbly this is? Everything, there's no white spots of flour, and it's ready to go. So next, I'm going to use 3 vodka and 3 water. You can use all water if you don't have vodka.
3 what teaspoons?
Tablespoons. And I pull them all around so they're not in one spot. They're drizzled around. You can always go a little short on the water or vodka and add a little bit later if it seems too dry. Now this is where usually you end up with a little mess. Just mixing the moisture in with it. And once I've got it messed around a little bit, Then I get my hands in here and I start making a ball. I don't want to heat the dough up too much, so I want to do this quickly without as much, too much contact. But I want to make sure that it's all equally moisturized. And you can see it's forming into a ball, so that's about right. If it doesn't hang together, you need to add maybe a little bit more moisture to it. Okay, now I'm going to make one big ball.
That already has the butter in it?
No, we use the butter later.
Oh.
Okay, this is just barely wet enough. That's why it doesn't want to stick together all that well. It's not sticking to my hands except where I went directly into the moisture. Okay, so that's about right. The next thing, and this is very important, this was a revelation to me. Up to this point, it's pretty much the way my mother made pie crust, except the vodka. And what makes it easier for me is this step. I just put a little water on my surface and spread it around, because I want to put saran wrap on the counter. This is where I'm going to roll it out. For some reason I always end up with a bigger circle than I really need, but I like to make sure I've got adequate space here to make the circle a little bit bigger than the pie, because it has to go down, in, and up. To start with, let's use about half the ball and my old trusty pie rolling pin, and this is going to take a little bit of rolling out, but I just roll from the middle out, and where it starts to separate at the edges, I just kind of close that up, and then I have to move this around. Okay, at this point it's fairly round and the edges are pushed together, and I've put this on there and I think it's going to be close. And here's what makes this method easier. I can pick up the corner and pick up this whole thing, drape it through the pie. I can move it around to where I'm happy with it if I want to move it. Get it down in there. And then pull it off. Okay, now I'm going to set this aside and roll out the other one in the same fashion. Okay, I'm just going to trim the edges off of this crust. Not tight to the pan, but just a little more even. And then I've rolled the top crust out much larger than it needs to be, because I'm going to make a fluted edge on the pie. And the apples will go in, the top goes on, and then we're going to do some preparation over here. So there's a little moisture in the pie at this point because the apples are juicing out with the sugar and the sugar is melted.
And that's okay.
And that's all okay, but it means you need to bake it right away so that it doesn't get soggy on the bottom. Preheat your oven, you're gonna have to look up Celsius. Preheat your oven to 375 before you do this part. And then I like to smash the apples in and pack them down pretty tight.
But it is mounded above the...
Yeah, it's mounded up, but get it good and packed in so that it when it cooks down you don't have a lot of crust falling. I need to wash my fingers before I go on. Again, this makes it easy to get the crust on, which is way more obviously than I need.
Thus the reason
But trimming is a lot easier than trying to piece in when you've gotten too skimpy.
Yeah, the scrap pie.
Now I'll trim this with about an inch beyond the rim. Okay, I wanted to show you the thickness of the pie crust. It's very thin. You cannot read the paper through it, but it needs to be thick enough to hold up and not break. So the next thing I do is seal the pie by turning that crust under and then pinching it down on the rim, and I'll do that and come back to you. Okay, so I wasn't very good at following my recipe or a script, and I forgot to put the butter and the nutmeg inside, so we'll do plan B on that. So what I did was I started the fluting all the way around, and I'm just pushing it in with my finger until I've gone all the way around. Okay, now this is plan B. This should not be done this way. Because I didn't put the butter and the nutmeg in, which I really like, I'm just going to take the crust and I'm going to cut the top out, and then I'm going to add the things that I want back in and put the top back on. Okay, so this is cold butter, and I just took the peeler and made little thin slabs to go over the top of the pie. This should be very cold when you do that, and it'll make really nice thin pieces. And then I forgot the nutmeg, which you can use, you can grate your own, or you can just sprinkle nutmeg over it. And then we'll put our flip top crust back on. And because I have one big air hole around the edge, technically I wouldn't have to make air holes, but if I'd done this right, I would come across the pie and put some air holes in it. Something like that. Then I have some cream. You can use cream or beaten egg white, and I only use that on the center of the pie, not on the fluted edge, because the fluted edge browns too quickly as it is. And I want it smeared pretty evenly around because the cream has sugar, milk sugar in it, and if you get piles of it in a spot, it tends to get too dark. So a little bit, and then just a little bit of granulated sugar sprinkled over the top. Makes a nice little crunch on the top. Sometimes I even use cinnamon sugar. And it's ready for the oven. This one isn't that pretty, but it'll taste good. Okay, so at this point, you should put it in a preheated oven on a low rack in the oven, and it doesn't have to be clear at the bottom, but fairly low because it's too hot in the top of the oven, and you want to cook the bottom crust rapidly, and it keeps it from being soggy. And then at this point, you're going to put your foil on the foil or your pie crust rim on, and it goes in the oven like this for 30 minutes. And then my oven, it doesn't cook evenly, so after 30 minutes I rotate it around and then cook it for another 20. And you'll know when it's done because a knife will go into the center and you won't have a lot of crunchiness. And you may also see out of some of these little holes, you may see a little bubbling juice. And you need to have a browned pie crust, and the apples fairly soft, and a little bit of bubbling to cook the sugars in it. So those are all the ways you tell when it's done.
Cool.
Okay, I reviewed the footage and I need to clarify a couple of things. You need to preheat your oven while you're peeling apples to 375 Fahrenheit or 190 Celsius. Then when you get to the creating the rolling the top crust in with the bottom crust to seal it, what I do is I take the bottom crust and I pull it out and I fold the top crust under it and then pinch it together, and I go around and do that. So make sure that gets tucked under and pinched together really well, or else your pie is going to dribble out into the oven. Okay, and so that's the finished pie. Our plan B pie, because we had to cut the middle out, this is the scrap pie that Rod and I are going to get to have. This is Rod's bread for today, and this has been Becky's apple pie made with love. Bye.